We're really keen on building not to the brief that the customer gives us, but to the problem behind the brief.
And how we like to use technology is have an impact on business problems and moving businesses forward rather than building technology for the sake of it. We like to think of ourselves as critical friends to our partners.
I think these large language models can also be applied to traditional machine learning tasks. Say during the submissions process, a lot of the metadata you would need to put into a form as part of the submissions process could automatically be extracted from the document.
ChatGPT just coming out and things, it's novel, but it's based on things that are already there and could be used. And publishers can really position themselves, I think, to make whatever comes next work for them and fit seamlessly into their operations.
New technology is always exciting.
All things SciComm. What does the future of science look like? What's happening in science communication? Here's your host, Nikesh Gosalia.
Hello and welcome to All Things SciComm. Now with AI becoming more mainstream than ever before, what sort of impact are we likely to see in the publication and discoverability of scientific research? That's what we are hoping to find out as we talk to Will Bailey and Simon Epstein from 67 Bricks.
All things SciComm. Today's innovator. Knock knock.
67 Bricks has been helping businesses overcome their technology challenges since 2007 and creating new opportunities in a more data-driven future. Today, they'll tell us about who they are, what they do, and how AI and machine learning will likely make a difference to academic publishing and more. So welcome, Will and Simon.
Thanks, Nikesh.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourselves, Will and Simon, and how you got started in technology?
Sure, yeah. I got started in technology at quite an early age. So in the 80s, would you believe, during the 8-bit home computer revolution, that's when I first became interested in technology. My dad brought home a Dragon 32 microcomputer, which is the kind of home computer that only a mother could love, to be fair. But nevertheless, it was enough to spark my interest in technology. That was replaced in the 90s by an Amiga, which is a fantastic machine, the machine on which I built my first neural network implementation, which more or less worked, but was very slow and a pain to train. And then fast forward 20 years, and we're using AI and machine learning as one tool amongst many at 67 Bricks, where they're very much sort of available off-the-shelf components that you can plug in and tune to your customer requirements. So I've been working at 67 Bricks for about 8 years now and still enjoying it. It's great.
And I came to technology a bit later in life than Simon. I started out in scholarly publishing about 10 years ago with Taylor and Francis, working in editorial and acquisitions roles in the books business there. And after a few years, felt that I wanted a fresh challenge and moved into consumer digital product management at a startup in Oxford, looking at real-time transport information for consumers. And I'd been aware of 67 Bricks for a few years and jumped at an opportunity to take a role as a consultant there at the start of 2020, just before the pandemic. So kind of marrying together publishing and technology experiences. And I'm now head of partnerships at 67 Bricks and work across our product development and consultancy offerings to ensure we're providing value to our clients across the information sector.
I know you mentioned very briefly about the journey with 67 Bricks. Just very curious, full disclaimer, I've known 67 Bricks for a while, fantastic organization, but maybe for our listeners, could you tell a little bit more about 67 Bricks, and maybe you can start with where the name 67 Bricks came from? And how's the journey been so far as the organization is concerned?
In terms of 67 Bricks and where the name came from, let's start there. 67 Bricks was founded by Inigo Sergei and Sam Herbert. And I think during one of their early meetings, they, as you do when you found a company, they came up with all the ways they felt that 67 Bricks, as yet unnamed, could help their customers or potential customers. And I believe fortuitously it was a total of 67 post-it notes on a whiteboard, and thus the name was born. That's more or less right, isn't it, Will?
I think that's the canonical version. Yeah, there's many versions of the story, but that's the that's the one I know to be true anyway. But yeah, that was back in 2007, as you said at the top. And since then, we've grown into a mature company of about 45 technologists and gained deep experience and expertise in the information services industries. We've worked with clients across standards publishing, scholarly and scientific communications, legal and regulatory publishing, which we'll talk a bit more about later on today, and business intelligence as well. We deliver consultancy services and new product development, focusing on content and data. with the aim of helping companies to transform their processes and user experiences and become digital product companies. It's been a great 15 years.
Talking a little bit about the academic industry, we know that there are quite a few challenges right now with the move towards open access, the Nelson memo, and on the other side, there are just enormous number of submissions coming in from all across the globe, and a lot of publishers have now started to talk more about AI and machine language solutions. So in your opinion, how do you think AI and machine language can help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the whole publication process, especially when you think of collaboration and communication being a need among authors, reviewers, and editors?
I'll pick up the editor side of things. The content generation using large language models is a hot topic right now. And perhaps there is a role for that. But I think these large language models can also be applied to traditional machine learning tasks. For example, ad hoc metadata extraction, say during the submissions process. A lot of the metadata you would need to put into a form as part of the submissions process could automatically be extracted from the document. And a large language model is well placed to do that. And you could look at illicit.org and how they're extracting metadata from search results on an ad hoc basis to see how that could work. So I think there's a role in streamlining, say, the submission systems. There's roles around summarizing content. So, for example, book chapters may not have an abstract equivalent. You could generate one using a large language model. You could do sentiment analysis, say, on citations. And going more broadly, I suppose you could use it to ensure consistency in the language used, that it's targeting a particular reading level and it's comprehensive, and indeed terminology, the use of terminology. There's a role there for that.
I think it's a potential interest, and thinking about the challenges that you touched on there, Nikesh, about the need to publish more to cope in the sort of changing OA landscape is identifying reviewers and reducing that as a pain point. I'm sure that's something that you'll run into a lot in your career. But we hear about publishers talking about it taking 200 attempts for editors to find 2 reviewers to review a piece of content. And that curation of the scholarly record is such a fundamental part of the value that scholarly publishers add to the scientific communication landscape that they have to keep doing that and to continue to exist and thrive. But if it's taking 200 attempts to find the right people to do that reviewing, they can't operate at the increased scale that OA business models are going to demand. So using these large language models and AI to connect content to the right people who you may not have known before, you may not have them in your network, but you know that they're working in the right kind of area for a paper. I think there's potential there. It's quite a specific example, but if removing that headache, I think there's lots of potential. And all the things that we've touched on there are things that publishers could be doing right now. These are all applications of AI technologies as they currently exist that they could be making the most of. I think by doing that, by making the most of what's possible now, the industry can kind of get itself into a position where it's playing a more active role in what comes in the future. These ChatGPT just coming out and things, it's novel, but it's based on things that are already there and could be used. And publishers can really position themselves, I think, to make whatever comes next work for them and fit seamlessly into their operations and help them to thrive.
I think as much as anything, it's fostering a culture which is supportive of innovation and supportive of adopting new technologies. As Will said, ChatGPT comes along, throws a light on things, makes everyone excited. But if you're already in the business of innovating and adopting new technologies, then you would just take it in your stride.
Absolutely. And I was going to touch upon a similar point, Simon. Will, you mentioned saying, have I seen similar things in my career? And I would say before COVID, when we were talking about things like AI and machine language, probably the industry was not completely ready for it. Maybe there was fear of, will it be 100% accurate? Will it lead to job losses? But I think with just the push towards open access, the push towards so much more content coming out, and some of these, maybe it's just a part of the adoption curve, we are starting to see more and more publishers, very traditional academic societies as well, being open to the idea of maybe trialing some of these tools. Is that something that you're hearing as well, Simon and Will, based on your experience working with publishers, societies, research institutes?
Yeah, I think so. Everybody's had a sort of background awareness of AI for decades, but not much of an understanding of what it means and what it could mean for them. So we've heard publishers say, we want AI, but without really necessarily thinking about what that means for them, what they want it for. People are comfortable with predictive technologies, but they don't necessarily understand what it could do for them. So I think something like ChatGPT, making this sort of thing accessible for people to play around with and think about how it fits into their day-to-day work, it kind of opens up the possibilities to actually integrate that into publishers' operations. So I think that's a really positive thing, and I think we will certainly see more focused application of this sort of work in the publishing workflow.
And we'll come back to ChatGPT because I'm sure a lot of listeners would like to know more about that, and especially your views. But just talking about some of the use cases, Simon and Will, we've spoken a lot around large language models, but do you think AI and machine language can also be used to enhance the discoverability and accessibility of academic publications?
Yes, absolutely. And the Case Genie product that we developed for ICLR, which I think we're going to talk about a bit later on, that's really what that product is about surfacing unknown unknowns, getting content in front of people who they wouldn't have had any sense of how to find that content without having read it already, because effectively that's what the machine is doing for them. Traditional search and discovery in academic publishing and more widely across the internet, you would have had to match terms with something in the content or something in the metadata or something that's been tagged by editorial people at some point. But what large language models allow us to do is infer content that's likely to be relevant based on what's in the content itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. Generative AI is presently transforming mainstream search. So you would have seen demos by Microsoft and Google recently to varying degrees of success, showing off their new search endpoints. But it does have real applications, because I think we've kind of been trained to use search engines to answer questions that we know that they can answer. But for example, if you asked a search engine, does Oxford or Paris have a greater population? You get a bunch of hits back about London and Paris probably, and you have to read them and find out which has got more. But this has real potential in academic research, because you could ask a large language model, summarize the state of research and thin film, state of the art in thin film research, and it would go away, find the top 10 papers by impact, summarize them and present you with the results. And that's a powerful use case. So I think we will see the impact, certainly in search and discoverability within academic publishing.
With technology, very often a lot of users are really worried about security, privacy. So based on your experience, how does 67 Bricks ensure the security and privacy of authors and reviewers' information and any data?
We are nearly always working in partnership with publishers who are the data owners here. And it's really important when doing that we act, as we've said, as a critical friend to advise them on sort of best practice and compliance around the GDPR and similar regulations, and sometimes to encourage them to be specific in the type of data that they want to collect, because there's often a tendency just to want to monitor everything and collect everything and then figure out what you want later. And that's kind of an easy trap to fall into, but you could end up paying quite a high price for that in terms of servicing information requests. What do you know about me? Provide me a report. It's better to be more targeted in the analytics you capture. In terms of the software that we build ourselves, our bespoke development, we follow good security practices, including things like encryption at rest as well as in transit, principle of least access for all of our systems, and multiple layers of security, so that a failure in a single one doesn't lead to an exploitable situation for our customers.
I know you've briefly mentioned that you work with different stakeholders as far as the information industry is concerned, but are there any specific projects or use cases that come to mind where 67 Bricks applied AI, machine language to achieve significant business results? And typically a lot of users are very curious about this particular tool is great, it looks very promising, but how do I actually measure the performance and effectiveness of AI machine language model in reality?
So in terms of raw model performance, like how well a machine learning algorithm is working, a set of well-established metrics that you can use to measure that. Probably if you consider like classification, what's a particular piece of content about, then the F1 score is a traditional measure by which you can determine how well it's performing. And you score that by, when you're training it, you hold some data back, which you know the answers to, and you can see how well it performs against the gold standard. So in terms of model performance, that's largely taken care of, and it's more about helping people understand what these numbers mean and where they're going wrong, what could be the causes behind that. In terms of business performance, we treat it as a tool like any other, really. So before we apply the solution, we would establish some key metrics to measure performance and then put the solution in place and then revisit. And so an example of that we've done recently is for an American standards organization, and they're interested in how machine readable their standards documents are, so that they can potentially be consumed by third-party systems downstream. A particular area of interest is around how requirements are expressed. And ideally, a requirement in a standard is something that you have to comply to. And ideally, you want them to be uniquely referenceable, like anything in life, so that you can say whether you're complying with it when new ones appear, when requirements change, you might have to revisit them. So we built a system to identify, first of all, these requirements, to measure when they occur as a single referenceable thing, and then express that as a fraction, for a particular standards document. And then that enabled them to look across all their authorship committees and identify trends. And, we found that some committees were much better at doing this than others. And then that kind of informed a best practice in terms of how they could go about improving their standards next time, they're reviewed, to make these requirements more granular and hence make their content more machine readable. So the metric there was granular requirements. We've measured it. They now know they need to improve in some areas, and then they can rerun the analysis after the next review cycle to see how things have changed.
As Simon says, these tools, AI, machine learning and natural language processing, they're tools like any other in the box. And when we engage with partners to understand what problems they're trying to solve, we might be deploying these sorts of tools to solve those problems. It might be something else. And ultimately, measuring their impact. There are things like F1 score and things to understand how well it's performing. But measuring the impact of these things is the same as with any other kind of business initiative. Where were you before? Where have you got to? Has it made an impact? And I think that's really how we work and how we like to use technology, is have an impact on business problems and moving businesses forward rather than building technology for the sake of it.
Yeah, just picking up on that last bit. I mean, we're really keen on building not to the brief that the customer gives us, but to the problem behind the brief. Sometimes it takes, a little while to get there, and you need to establish trust before people are willing to have perhaps their assumptions challenged. But I think, we do a reasonable job in doing that and keeping both ourselves, and our customers honest in that regard.
No, I think that's a great point. In my experience, I've seen that as well, that I think there's a lot of reassurance that is required in the beginning, where you need to tell a potential client to have faith, have trust. It is also an iterative process. So, it's not going to do magic overnight. So the systems are learning. It'll take some time, but we can deliver results. But you have to kind of partner with us on this journey. And it's not that, we've got something that's just going to change the world in a day. So, yeah, I think that's something that we've seen as well. Yeah.
I was just going to follow up on what Simon said. We like to think of ourselves as critical friends to our partners. So it's all about challenging those assumptions. And an organisation might come to us and say, we want to build this thing. And we'll spend time trying to get to the bottom of why it is that they want to do that and the problem that they think it's going to be solving. And, that might be setting up a new revenue stream or improving some efficiency to absorb declining revenues. But getting to the fundamental reason for why they want to do something is really important in then doing the right thing and developing the right product. And ultimately, a lot of the time, it's about surviving and thriving as a business. And businesses that survive and thrive are businesses that give customers what they want and need. So I think that's, getting to the bottom. That's how you get to good UX. That's how you get to good solutions. That's how you get to good deployments of machine learning and AI.
Talking a little bit about what you mentioned towards the end of what you were saying, Will, I know for a fact, I've heard that from other customers as well, that 67 Bricks is very customer centric. And so is there something specific that you want to just briefly talk about as far as the user experience and incorporating user feedback during the whole development and implementation of the process is concerned?
I think that's right. And I think that thing of getting back to kind of key business drivers for developing a product, I think that aligns you with the user perspective anyway. It means that you have to bring users into the centre of the picture and understand what it is that they want and need. So going into a product development, we'll always try to engage with what users are saying, what it is that they need to perform their jobs or to get hold of content that they want. And then once we're into building the products, quickly releasing software, getting it in front of people, getting feedback. It's, the agile user feedback story, but we really do live by it. And getting end-to-end systems working, getting feedback on them, building that back in, that's fundamental to the way that we develop products. It means that we can move very quickly and start delivering value to businesses very quickly with users at the centre of it all. And as to pick up Simon's point, that gets you to the right solution, gets you to the right product at the end of it, rather than just fulfilling the brief at the start. So it's not exactly a kind of iffy statement, but
all I would add is it's always better, I think, nearly always better to speak to the real end users rather than someone who purports to speak for them, because you often get a filtered and partial view then, and that can be somewhat misleading. But equally, you need to tread carefully there.
I think that's a great point, Simon. So talking a little bit about ChatGPT, before we get into more details, just wanted to know from your perspective, Simon and Will, do you think that it's a bit of an exaggeration that everyone's talking about ChatGPT suddenly and it's changing the world? Or do you think that it is something which was already existing? It's probably come more in light because, I don't know, it's freely available. Suddenly terms like large language models, and there's Microsoft, more interested in this, and Google more interested in it. Because I've been, to be honest, I've been hearing both sides of the story. Some folks who've been saying, I don't know what the big deal is. There were tools that were already kind of being developed. Work was already being done. There are similar tools perhaps available as well. And so we are maybe kind of exaggerating the whole thing. But there are folks who are saying that, now maybe there's going to be the launch of ChatGPT 4 and there'll be more layers added to it and it's game changing. So before we go into details, Simon, what are your thoughts?
I think you're right. It is nuanced. We see both sides of it. If you kind of compare it to blockchain and the hype around blockchain, I would say that we're kind of in a similar kind of phase, but I think the potential applications of large language models are probably slightly broader than the potential applications of blockchain technology. Both were new things, but I do think that on balance, if we're going to get into the details later, which I'm quite enthusiastic about doing, I think that the potential applications are probably slightly broader in this case. But yes, there's a certain amount of hype at the moment, certainly.
It's not easy to say 100% it's great and brand new, or 100% it's terrible and nothing special. We've been talking about it quite a bit over the last few days and reading and listening to various things. And I think my view is it's a movable feast, lots of potential risks as well. It's really interesting, and I think that the question of it being openly accessible, I think that's why it's such a big piece of news at the moment, I'm sure, because anybody can stick something into ChatGPT or into DALL-E and get AI generated results back. And I think, again, there's potential for that and there's potential dangers for that.
Yeah, just I suppose picking up on that and the potential dangers. So let's go pessimistic. Let's start pessimistic. So in terms of the cons, well, I don't know. It's certainly my natural state, but I'm putting a thin veneer of optimism over it. So in terms of I suppose in terms of pessimism, then there's a lot of bias baked into the model, because it's trained on common core data from the internet, and you can see that quite readily. If you ask it for 5 suggested jobs for your friend Sophie, who's recently graduated, and compare that to your friend Ralph, then you'll find things like social media manager and HR assistant will occur in one list and not the other. But on the positive side, there are data sets being developed to quantify this level of bias, something like WinOgenda, where you have through co-reference resolution. So for an example, better if I give you an example. So say the nurse told his patient that his shift was ending in an hour, then you can ask the model, which of the nouns is his referring to, and compare that to a similar sentence when you use their. And then through that, you can assess to what degree the model is representing a bias in gender. And, the development of that is, and the use of that and publication of those numbers on the model card is a good way to be transparent about the biases that are present in your model. I would say that the content is, it's very much a black box in that people don't really understand how it works. I suppose going back to what you were saying about DALL-E, I think I showed my son DALL-E and said, look, let's generate an image. It could be anything. And he's like, well, what about a dog holding a machine gun? That is what he said. And, generated a picture of a dog sort of holding a machine gun. It wasn't very good, And he was completely underwhelmed because he just thought I'd searched it, he thought, and that's a dangerous mindset, because there's a certain provenance around search that someone created it, a human created it. But because the interface is the same, then that it has that inherent kind of believability, which I think is slightly worrying. I'm going to sort of wrap up on the pessimism there, unless Will, do you want to expound on?
I'll pick up the baton. I think that I really agree with that point about people you can't necessarily perceive the difference between having searched for something and it being a generated thing, a new output. But even if you do grasp that it's a new output and it's been generated on the fly, that's great for some applications. But any sort of buzz about, you see people being really impressed that it's done a picture in the same style as Van Gogh. DALL-E's done a picture in the same style as Van Gogh. Just because it can make a facsimile of art, that doesn't mean that it can do art. It can't create art, because that's a human experience. You need experience and consciousness and all sorts of philosophical things to be able to do that. And also because models like ChatGPT are based on things that have come before, it's fundamentally a reductive, generative kind of process. It can only produce variations of things that have happened already. So it can only ever go down narrower and narrower rabbit holes rather than expand what we already have. And I think, that's dangerous because it will entrench biases that already exist. And you could get it to write a soap opera script, but you couldn't get it to write some piece of art or a script that's going to move us forward and win an Oscar. There's a difference there, and no slight to people that write soap operas. The generation's amazing, and people grasp that it is generating things new and on the fly, and they can make the most of those, and they fit their use cases. That's great, but it is limited. It's fundamentally limited by what's come before.
I suppose to put us back towards the positives, new technology is always exciting. Okay, we're technologists, new technology is always exciting. I think that it's worth looking at the trajectory of DALL-E and where the innovation has come from following that, in that, following the release of DALL-E, then Stable Diffusion came out. There's been some really interesting work. I mean, we're getting quite mainstream now, using Stable Diffusion, and it's open source. The number of contributions is way higher than a private company could manage, and you can find really, really cool stuff on YouTube. So like the Corridor crew doing stuff with Stable Diffusion and ControlNet, which ControlNet you can think of as like edge detection. So you can say determine the edges in an image and generate an image which conforms to that layout, if you like, but in a different style. And that allows them to, say, build superhero videos. So I could be sat here as a superhero, and frame by frame, Stable Diffusion can generate the equivalent image of me, but I guess more handsome and muscly. Then, that's on commodity hardware. It's really exciting. But the point I'm making is the really exciting thing in terms of ChatGPT may well come from open source or freely available models. And you can see this already. I mean, this week has been a really exciting week in large language models. People are talking about how sort of ChatGPT and its ilk are reaching the Stable Diffusion moment. So a couple of examples to kind of highlight that. Facebook released their Llama model a few months ago, I think, or recently. Can't remember exactly when. But this week, there are now one-click installers for people to run that at home on their hardware. I mean, I could download it and run it on my laptop if it were slightly better than it is. So that's really important, because that means that potential contributors to derivatives of that model have access to it and can tinker with it. And you're going to see an explosion in applications there. I mean, I could go on and on, but another really exciting one. They've all got really great names as well. So the one-click installer, that's called Dalai Lama. I mean, that's just brilliant, isn't it? That's the best product name I've heard in a long time. There's one called, more recently, I think yesterday, Alpaca came out, and Alpaca's like a ChatGPT implementation of Llama that you can run on a single GPU in the cloud. This is really, really funny, right? Because the training data set that they use to fine-tune Llama to respond better to instructional prompts is derived from a set of training data which was built using GPT-3. So there's this self-instruct framework whereby you can get a language model to generate tasks and then get it to generate responses to those tasks and iterate. And they've taken that training data set applied it to Llama, and now Llama can answer questions like ChatGPT can. I mean, not quite as good, but this is a couple of researchers this week. It's really at a critical stage, and it's very, very exciting.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. I wasn't aware of all of that, Simon. So, I think I'm sure the listeners are going to benefit from that as well.
That's all the time we have today. Catch more of this episode in the next part with your host, Nikesh Gosalia. See you soon.